The strange thing wasn't that I disappeared. The strange thing was that it took my own family almost 2 weeks to notice I was gone. My name is Harold Bennett, and I was 74 years old when I finally walked away from the life I had spent decades building. By the time anyone bothered to ask where I was, $18.4 million had already vanished with me, every transfer completed legally, every signature verified, every account closed exactly the way I had planned. The newspapers later called it one of the most unusual disappearances our county had ever seen. My son called it betrayal. My daughter-in-law called it madness. But neither of them asked the only question that truly mattered. Why would an old man leave behind everything he had ever known without saying goodbye? The answer had been growing quietly for 10 long years. The morning they realized I was missing began like any other Tuesday in early October. The maple trees lining my neighborhood in northern Vermont had already turned brilliant shades of red and gold. A cool breeze drifted across the empty front porch of the house where I had lived for nearly 45 years. My mailbox remained unopened. My curtains stayed perfectly still. The neighbors assumed I had taken another one of my quiet morning walks. I had always enjoyed walking the country roads with a cup of coffee before sunrise, watching the mist rise above the fields while the rest of the town slowly woke up. But this morning was different. My pickup truck was gone. The lights inside the house had been turned off. Even the old rocking chair on the porch had disappeared. 3 days passed before anyone knocked on my front door. It wasn't my son, Michael. It wasn't my daughter-in-law, Laura. It wasn't either of my grandchildren. It was the mail carrier who noticed several packages piling up by the entrance. Another day passed before a neighbor called the local sheriff for a wellness check. The deputies found the house spotless. Every room looked carefully arranged, as though someone had spent hours making sure nothing had been left out of place. The closets were empty. Family photographs had been removed from the walls. The kitchen cabinets held only a few forgotten coffee mugs. There were no signs of panic. No signs of forced entry. No signs that anyone had left in a hurry. It looked less like someone had disappeared and more like someone had quietly erased himself from his own life. The first real surprise came later that afternoon. Michael arrived looking more annoyed than worried, insisting his father had probably gone on one of his stubborn little adventures without telling anyone. Laura folded her arms and muttered that I had always enjoyed making people wonder where I was. But their confidence disappeared the moment my attorney refused to answer their questions and directed them instead to First National Bank. Inside a private conference room, a bank manager calmly informed them that every personal account under Harold Bennett had been closed according to signed instructions that had been prepared months earlier. Investment portfolios had been transferred. Safe deposit boxes had been emptied. Property taxes had been prepaid. Every document had passed multiple legal reviews. There had been no fraud, no theft, no missing paperwork. Everything had been executed exactly as I had requested. Michael reportedly stared at the banker for several seconds before asking the question everyone else would soon repeat. Where did my father go? The banker simply shook his head. Mr. Bennett never shared his destination. He only said that if anyone came looking for him after he left, they were already far too late. I wish I could tell you that my family immediately searched every road, called every friend, and stayed awake every night hoping I would come home. That would have made for a comforting story. The truth was far quieter than that. Long before I packed my last suitcase, they had already grown used to living without me. My disappearance simply made official what had been happening for years. It all began 10 years earlier, a few weeks after my wife Evelyn passed away. We had been married for 48 years. She had been the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, baked fresh pies every Thanksgiving, and somehow managed to make every person who stepped into our home feel like family. When she was gone, the silence inside that old farmhouse felt almost physical. Every clock seemed louder. Every empty chair reminded me that half of my life had disappeared. During those first months, Michael visited every Sunday. Laura usually came along, bringing the grandchildren, Ethan and Sophie. They stayed for lunch, talked about school, work, and neighborhood news, then headed home before dinner. I believed we would slowly adjust to our new reality together. I believed family naturally grew closer after loss. Instead, the visits became shorter. Sunday turned into once a month. Once a month became holidays only. Eventually, even the holidays came with excuses. Someone had the flu. Ethan had baseball practice. Sophie had dance competitions. Laura's parents were hosting dinner this year. They promised they would stop by another weekend, but another weekend rarely arrived. At first, I defended them in my own mind. Young families were busy. Careers demanded long hours. Children needed attention. I had raised Michael myself, and I knew how exhausting those years could be. Whenever neighbors asked why my family was not around as often, I smiled and said they had their own lives now. I wanted people to think well of them. I wanted to think well of them myself. Little changes accumulated almost too quietly to notice. My birthday became a quick phone call instead of dinner together. Father's Day became a text message sent sometime during the afternoon. Christmas gifts arrived through delivery services with printed cards instead of handwritten notes. Even when Michael called, our conversations rarely lasted longer than 5 minutes. He usually sounded distracted, apologizing because another meeting was about to start or because he needed to drive the children somewhere. Laura was always polite whenever we spoke, but her kindness felt carefully measured, as though speaking with me had become another task on her weekly schedule. The grandchildren grew taller every year, yet I knew them mostly through photographs posted online. I watched birthdays, vacations, school concerts, and family barbecues unfold on a glowing screen instead of around my own. Dining room table. Sometimes I recognized places they had visited because Evelyn and I had taken Michael there when he was a boy. Other times I realized they had created entirely new traditions without ever inviting me to become part of them. One autumn afternoon, I drove nearly 40 miles to watch Ethan play in a Little League championship game. I sat quietly on the aluminum bleachers wearing a baseball cap pulled low over my face. Michael never noticed I was there. Laura walked past me twice carrying snacks for other parents without recognizing me. After the game, everyone gathered for pictures near home plate. Grandparents from both sides hugged the children, smiling beneath the bright afternoon sun. I remained seated until the parking lot emptied. Then I drove home alone with a small folding lawn chair still sitting in the bed of my truck. That evening I heated a bowl of canned soup, looked around the quiet kitchen Evelyn had once filled with laughter, and understood something I had refused to admit for years. Nobody had pushed me out of the family with cruel words. They had simply stopped making room for me, one forgotten invitation at a time. The morning after I sat alone in my kitchen and accepted that painful truth, I did something I had not done in years. I stopped waiting for the telephone to ring. It sounded like such a small decision, almost meaningless, but it quietly changed the direction of my life. For nearly a decade, I had organized my days around the possibility that Michael might call, that Laura might ask if I wanted to join them for dinner, or that one of my grandchildren might suddenly remember that their grandfather was still alive. Every Saturday, I cleaned the guest room just in case someone decided to spend the night. Every Thanksgiving, I bought enough groceries to feed 8 people even though I usually finished the holiday eating leftovers alone. Hope can become a habit, and habits are difficult to break. Once I stopped expecting visitors, I began noticing things I had ignored for years. Whenever Michael did visit, his attention rarely wandered beyond practical matters. He asked whether I had paid my property taxes. He wondered if maintaining such a large house was becoming difficult. He casually mentioned how expensive home repairs could be for someone my age. At first, I believed he was simply concerned. After all, every son worries about an aging father. But the conversations always ended the same way. He suggested that maybe I should think about selling the house someday. Laura often nodded in quiet agreement before changing the subject. Not once did either of them ask whether I was happy living there. They only asked whether I was still able to afford it. One afternoon, Laura brought over coffee and a bakery pie. She smiled warmly, complimented the flowers Evelyn had planted years earlier, then mentioned that larger homes were becoming increasingly valuable in our county. She laughed lightly and said young families would love a property like mine. I smiled back and poured her another cup of coffee, but something about that conversation stayed with me long after she drove away. It was the first time I realized people could discuss your future without including you in it. A few weeks later, I attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by my longtime friend George. Several familiar faces asked where Michael and his family were. Before I could answer, another neighbor cheerfully said they had seen photographs online of everyone enjoying a weekend at a lake resort. I smiled politely, pretending I already knew about the trip. I even commented that the weather looked beautiful. The truth was that I had learned about the vacation only seconds earlier. That evening I looked through the pictures myself. There were dozens of smiling faces. Michael stood beside Laura with his arm around her shoulder. Ethan proudly held up a fishing trophy nearly as long as his arm. Sophie laughed beside a campfire wrapped in a plaid blanket. Every photograph captured happiness. Every photograph also confirmed something else. There had never been an empty chair waiting for me. They had not forgotten to invite me at the last minute. They had planned the entire weekend without ever considering my place in it. I closed the computer, washed my coffee mug, and walked into Evelyn's old sewing room. Her favorite rocking chair still sat beside the window exactly where she had left it. Dust floated gently through the afternoon sunlight. I sat there for nearly an hour, listening to nothing except the quiet creaking of the wooden floor beneath my feet. For the first time since losing her, I imagined what she would say if she could see me now. She had always believed kindness should never require humiliation. She often reminded Michael as a little boy that love was something people chose every day through simple actions, not grand speeches. Sitting alone in that silent room, I realized I had spent 10 years offering understanding to people who had slowly stopped offering me the smallest place in their lives. That realization did not make me angry. It made me calm, and sometimes calm decisions become the ones that change everything. The decision did not happen in a single afternoon. It unfolded quietly, one ordinary day after another, until it no longer felt like a decision at all. It felt like common sense. I began organizing the house the way Evelyn always had. Every drawer was cleaned. Every cabinet was sorted. I donated boxes of old clothes to the local church, gave gardening tools to neighbors who would actually use them, and packed away family keepsakes with handwritten labels. Anyone walking through the house would have assumed an old man was simply preparing for a smaller, easier life. They would have been partly correct. What they could not see was that I was also preparing for a life where nobody could quietly decide my future without my permission. One crisp Monday morning, I drove nearly 60 miles to Burlington to meet an attorney named William Carter. He had been recommended by a retired banker I trusted, someone who believed in careful planning rather than rushed decisions. Mr. Carter greeted me with a firm handshake and a calm smile. He never rushed me. He never assumed he already knew why I had come. Instead, he listened. For nearly 2 hours, I spoke about Evelyn, about the farmhouse, about my family, and about the strange feeling of becoming invisible while still sitting at the same dinner table. When I finally finished, he folded his hands and asked only one question. Mr. Bennett, are you trying to punish your family, or are you trying to protect your own peace? I looked out his office window for a long moment before answering. Peace, I said quietly. I have spent enough years hoping people would choose me. I would rather choose my own future. He nodded without judgment. From that day forward, every step was planned with patience. We reviewed every investment account, every retirement fund, every insurance policy, and every deed connected to my name. Nothing happened overnight. There were forms to complete, signatures to verify, and waiting periods required by law. I appreciated that. Important decisions deserved careful timing. During the months that followed, I learned more about my own finances than I had in the previous 20 years. Evelyn had always handled household budgets with remarkable precision, and after losing her, I had simply continued living comfortably without paying much attention to the details. Now I understood every account, every dividend, every tax record, and every long-term investment. Knowledge brought confidence. Confidence slowly replaced fear. Meanwhile, life continued exactly as before. Michael called every few weeks. Laura occasionally asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store. The conversations remained polite, predictable, and surprisingly shallow. Not once did either of them notice the steady transformation taking place beneath the surface of my quiet routine. They saw an aging father mowing his lawn, attending church on Sundays, and drinking coffee on the front porch each morning. They never saw the folders neatly organized inside my study or the growing stack of legal documents resting inside a locked cabinet. One afternoon, Michael stopped by unexpectedly after work. As we stood in the garage, he looked around at the shelves and remarked that I had accumulated far too much over the years. He laughed and said that someday he would probably spend weeks sorting through everything. His words were casual. He meant no obvious harm. Yet they lingered in the air long after he drove away. Someday. He spoke as though my life had already become an estate waiting to be divided rather than a story still being lived. That evening I unlocked the cabinet, reviewed every document one more time, and added another page to the folder Mr. Carter had prepared. It was not an act of anger. It was an act of clarity. I had finally accepted something Evelyn would have understood immediately. Respect cannot be inherited. Love cannot be assumed. Presents cannot be demanded. They are gifts people choose to give each day. And when those gifts quietly disappear, a wise person does not spend the rest of life standing beside an empty mailbox hoping something forgotten will eventually arrive. The first person who noticed the change in me was not my son. It was Margaret Collins, my next-door neighbor for almost 20 years. Every Wednesday afternoon, she walked her golden retriever past my mailbox, and if I happened to be outside, she would stop for a few minutes to talk about the weather, her vegetable garden, or whatever book she had just finished reading. After Evelyn passed away, those short conversations quietly became part of my routine. Margaret never treated me like a man waiting for the end of his story. She asked about my opinions instead of my health. She remembered my birthday without checking a calendar. She laughed at my old jokes even when she had heard them before. One afternoon, she noticed the moving boxes stacked neatly inside my garage. She tilted her head and smiled. "Cleaning house?" she asked. I smiled back. "Something like that." She looked at me for a moment longer than usual, as though she could tell there was another answer hidden beneath the first one. "You seem lighter these days," she said. "Not happier exactly. Just lighter." I thought about that after she walked away. She was right. I was not happier. There was still an empty chair at my kitchen table every morning, and there always would be. I still missed Evelyn whenever I passed her favorite flower bed or reached for the coffee mugs she had picked out years ago. Grief had not disappeared. But something else had. I was no longer carrying the weight of waiting for people who had already moved on with their lives. A few weeks later, Margaret invited me to a charity luncheon at the local community center. Normally, I would have declined, convinced that I would only feel out of place. Instead, I accepted. That afternoon, I met retired teachers, former firefighters, veterans, and widows who had all discovered new chapters long after they believed life had settled into silence. One gentleman had learned watercolor painting at 78. Another volunteered twice a week delivering meals to homebound seniors. Listening to their stories, I realized something I had forgotten. Growing older did not mean becoming invisible. It only meant finding people who still looked you in the eye. I began volunteering at the public library every Friday morning, repairing worn books and organizing donated collections. Children wandered through the reading room after school, asking innocent questions about history and old photographs. Some afternoons I spent an hour explaining how rotary telephones worked or why handwritten letters once meant so much. Those conversations filled a quiet place inside me that I had almost given up on. Nobody there cared how much money I had earned or what property I owned. They simply appreciated that I showed up. Meanwhile, my family continued living exactly as before. Weeks sometimes passed without a single call. Then suddenly Michael would telephone because he needed advice about a contractor or wanted to know whether I remembered the warranty information for an old piece of equipment. Laura occasionally sent cheerful holiday messages decorated with colorful family photographs. I always replied kindly. I never complained. I never mentioned the birthdays they missed or the invitations that never came. I had stopped keeping score. Instead, I began keeping records of something far more important. Every document Mr. Carter requested was copied, organized, and stored safely. Every account was reviewed with remarkable precision. Every decision was made while my mind remained clear and my heart remained steady. One rainy evening, Margaret stopped by with homemade chicken soup after hearing I had caught a stubborn cold. As we sat watching raindrops slide down the front windows, she asked a question nobody else had ever bothered to ask. "Harold, what do you want the rest of your life to look like?" I did not answer immediately. I stared across the yard where Evelyn had once planted rows of tulips that still bloomed every spring without asking permission from anyone. Finally, I smiled. "Peace," I said softly. "Just enough peace to wake up each morning feeling like my life still belongs to me." Margaret nodded as though she understood completely. In that quiet moment, I realized she had become the only person who truly saw me, not as an aging father waiting to be remembered, but as a man who still had every right to decide how the final chapters of his own story would be written. By the following spring, every piece of my plan had fallen quietly into place, but there was still one question I needed answered before I could leave everything behind. I needed to know whether my family had truly drifted away from me, or whether they had simply become distracted by life. Those are two very different things. Busy people eventually come back. People who have stopped caring rarely do. I decided to give them one final opportunity without telling them it was a test. My 75th birthday was approaching in early May. Evelyn had always insisted birthdays should never be extravagant. She believed the greatest gift was having the people you loved gathered around one table. Following her tradition, I mailed handwritten invitations nearly 3 weeks in advance. Michael received one at his office. Laura received another at their home. I even included small notes for Ethan and Sophie, telling them I had saved their favorite homemade peach pie recipe if they wanted to learn how their grandmother used to make it. As I slipped each envelope into the mailbox, I realized I was not mailing invitations. I was mailing hope one final time. During the days that followed, I cleaned the dining room more carefully than I had in years. I polished the old oak table until I could see my reflection in its surface. I took Evelyn's best china out of the cabinet, washed every plate by hand, and ironed the white linen tablecloth she had embroidered decades earlier. At the grocery store, I bought fresh vegetables. A small prime rib roast, strawberries, vanilla ice cream, and the ingredients for her peach pie. The cashier smiled and asked whether I was expecting company. "I certainly hope so," I replied. On the morning of my birthday, the sun filled every room with soft golden light. I brewed fresh coffee before 7 o'clock, opened the windows, and listened to birds singing in the maple trees. Every few minutes I glanced toward the driveway without even realizing I was doing it. 10 o'clock passed. Then noon. By 1 in the afternoon, my telephone finally rang. I smiled before answering, convinced someone was calling to say they were running late. Instead, it was an automated reminder about a routine medical appointment the following week. I thanked the recording with a quiet laugh at my own foolish optimism. By late afternoon, the roast remained untouched inside the oven, kept warm far longer than it should have been. The peach pie cooled on the kitchen counter beside 4 empty dessert plates that no one would use. At 6:15, I checked my telephone one last time. There were 2 promotional electronic mail messages from local hardware stores and a weather alert predicting light rain overnight. Nothing else. No missed calls. No birthday wishes. No apologies. As evening settled over the farmhouse, I carried a single plate to the dining table and ate slowly in complete silence. The food tasted exactly the way Evelyn would have wanted, yet every bite reminded me that traditions cannot survive when only one person continues honoring them. After dinner, I wrapped the remaining slices of pie and delivered half of them to Margaret, who answered her front door looking genuinely surprised. The moment she wished me a happy birthday, I realized she had remembered without needing a calendar notification or a social media reminder. She invited me inside, lit a single candle she found in her kitchen drawer, and insisted that birthdays deserved at least one flame, no matter how small the celebration. We shared pie, talked about books, and laughed over stories from decades earlier. It was one of the simplest evenings I had experienced in years, yet it felt more sincere than any holiday gathering I could remember. When I returned home that night, I did not feel angry. I did not even feel disappointed anymore. Something inside me had finally become still. I walked into my study, unlocked the cabinet, and called William Carter the following morning. "It is time," I told him. "There is nothing left to wait for." He remained silent for a moment before answering calmly. "Then we will move forward exactly as you instructed." I thanked him, hung up the telephone, and looked around the quiet house one last time with fresh eyes. For the first time in 10 years, I was not hoping someone would choose me. I had finally chosen myself. The next several months moved with remarkable quietness, almost as though the world itself had agreed to let me leave without drawing attention to the process. Mr. Carter and I met regularly, never rushing a single decision. Every appointment began the same way. He placed a legal pad on the conference table, reviewed the previous week's progress, and asked whether I wished to change anything. My answer never changed. I was not escaping my past. I was protecting what remained of my future. Together, we transferred investments into carefully structured accounts, updated beneficiary documents, established a charitable foundation that would become active after my departure, and arranged every legal detail so that nothing would depend on confusion or conflict. Every signature carried intention. Every document reflected months of thoughtful planning rather than emotion. Back at the farmhouse, life appeared wonderfully ordinary. I still mowed the lawn every Saturday morning. I still waved to neighbors walking their dogs. I still attended church and volunteered at the library every Friday. If anyone had watched closely, they would have seen an elderly widower living a peaceful retirement. Nobody noticed that each passing week quietly reduced the number of possessions inside the house. Furniture that held no sentimental value was donated to local families starting over. Boxes of tools found new homes with young neighbors who appreciated them. Books I had already read twice were given to the library where children might discover them. For the first time, I found unexpected joy in watching useful things continue serving someone else. The house slowly became lighter, and somehow so did I. One afternoon, Michael called asking whether he could stop by after work. When he arrived, he stood in the living room for a moment, looking around with mild surprise. "It feels different in here," he said. "Did you redecorate?" I smiled and told him I had simply decided to keep only what I truly needed. He nodded absent-mindedly before mentioning that home prices in our area had climbed again. He estimated what the property might be worth in the current market and joked that I was probably sitting on a small fortune. I laughed politely and changed the subject by asking about Ethan's first year of college. Michael answered with pride, describing classes, roommates, and future plans. I listened carefully because I genuinely wanted to hear every detail. Before leaving, he hugged me briefly and promised we should have dinner together soon. As his truck disappeared down the driveway, I realized he had never once asked why the house looked emptier or whether I needed help. He had noticed the value of the property before noticing the changes in my life. A few days later, I drove to the cemetery carrying fresh white lilies for Evelyn. I had visited her every month since the funeral, but this trip felt different. I sat quietly beside her headstone as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through towering maple trees. There was no dramatic speech, no grand farewell. I simply thanked her. I thanked her for every ordinary morning we had shared, every challenge we had faced together, and every lesson she had quietly taught me about dignity. Then I made one final promise. "I am going to be all right," I whispered. I finally understand that loving people does not mean waiting forever to be noticed. As I stood to leave, a gentle breeze carried a few fallen leaves across the grass, and for the first time in many years, I walked back to my truck without looking over my shoulder. That evening, I returned home and found a thick envelope from Mr. Carter waiting inside my mailbox. Everything was ready. Airline reservations had been confirmed under my legal name. A modest condominium overlooking the ocean in a small coastal town several states away had been purchased months earlier through perfectly lawful arrangements. My medical records had been transferred. My forwarding instructions would remain sealed until the proper time. I placed the envelope on my kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and looked around the quiet room one last time. Nothing about the house felt sad anymore. It felt complete. The story that had begun there with love had reached its natural ending. The next chapter would begin somewhere no one would think to look, not because I wanted to be found, but because I finally wanted the freedom to live as someone remembered by himself before expecting to be remembered by anyone else. The morning I left looked almost exactly like every other morning I had lived in that house. I woke before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and carried my favorite ceramic mug onto the front porch. The air was cool enough to require a light jacket, and a gentle breeze moved through the maple trees that Evelyn had always admired each autumn. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested that anything important was about to happen. The newspaper landed at the end of the driveway. A school bus passed a few minutes later. Somewhere down the road, a lawnmower started its familiar hum. Ordinary sounds have a way of making extraordinary moments feel almost unreal. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, and placed it upside down on the drying rack exactly where it had always belonged. Then I walked through each room one final time. I did not linger. I did not cry. The living room still carried faint traces of lavender from the candles Evelyn used to enjoy. The kitchen window framed the vegetable garden where we had spent countless summer evenings together. My study was nearly empty now, except for one wooden desk and a small framed photograph of the two of us standing beside the farmhouse on the day we moved in. I slipped the photograph into my travel bag and quietly turned off the lights. Before locking the front door, I placed a sealed envelope inside the mailbox addressed to William Carter. It contained the final authorization, allowing him to begin every instruction exactly 48 hours after my departure. Another envelope rested safely inside his office, to be opened only after my family eventually contacted him. Everything had been arranged months earlier. There would be no confusion, no legal disputes caused by missing paperwork, and no unanswered financial questions. The only mystery remaining would be why I had chosen to leave. Margaret was waiting in her driveway when I backed my truck onto the road. She did not ask where I was going. She had respected my privacy from the beginning. Instead, she walked over carrying a small paper bag. Inside were 2 homemade blueberry muffins and a handwritten note that simply read, "Wherever life takes you, I hope it greets you with the kindness you have always shown others." I smiled, thanked her, and hugged her for a long moment. "You helped me remember that I still mattered," I said quietly. She shook her head with gentle determination. "No, Harold. You never stopped mattering. You only forgot that other people do not get to decide your worth." Those words stayed with me long after I drove away. I left Vermont before the morning traffic began, following quiet highways that stretched through mountains, small towns, and open countryside. Every mile seemed to lift another invisible weight from my shoulders. I was not running from anyone. I was driving toward a life that no longer depended on invitations that never arrived or telephone calls that never came. Late that afternoon, I reached the small coastal town that would become my new home. It was peaceful without being isolated, filled with modest homes, family-owned restaurants, and long walking paths overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. My condominium was simple but bright, with large windows facing the water and a small balcony where I could watch fishing boats leave the harbor each morning. I unpacked only what I needed, made the bed, placed Evelyn's photograph beside a reading lamp, and opened every window to let the salt air fill the rooms. The following day, nearly 300 miles away, life continued exactly as expected at the farmhouse. Nobody called. Nobody knocked on the front door. Nobody wondered why the curtains remained closed. Another day passed before neighbors began noticing unopened mail collecting near the entrance. By then I was already walking along the shoreline just after sunrise, listening to waves instead of silence. When the wellness check eventually revealed an empty house and carefully organized rooms, the questions began spreading far faster than answers ever could. Michael searched every familiar place he could think of. Laura called hospitals and nearby hotels. Friends, neighbors, and local deputies all tried to piece together a timeline that no longer pointed anywhere. Yet every path eventually led to the same conclusion. Harold Bennett had not disappeared in confusion or fear. He had left with patience, purpose, and enough careful preparation to ensure that by the time anyone realized he was truly gone, the life they assumed would always be waiting for them had quietly sailed beyond the horizon. 5 days after I arrived in my new home, William Carter invited Michael and Laura to his office. By then the rumors had spread across town. Some believed I had become confused and wandered away. Others imagined I had secretly moved into an assisted living community. Nobody guessed the truth because the truth had never been hidden. It had simply never occurred to anyone that an old man might choose himself after spending years choosing everyone else. Mr. Carter welcomed them into the conference room with the same calm professionalism he had shown me from the very beginning. A single envelope rested neatly on the polished wooden table. Beside it sat a small flash drive and several organized folders containing legal documents. Michael immediately asked where I was. Mr. Carter answered honestly, "I know that Mr. Bennett is safe. Beyond that, I am legally obligated to respect his wishes." Laura leaned forward and asked whether I had taken all of my money. Mr. Carter quietly opened one folder and slid several documents across the table. Every transfer had been completed according to the law. Every account had been closed with proper authorization. The charitable foundation had already been funded. The remaining assets belonged solely to me and would remain under my control. Nothing had been stolen because everything had belonged to me from the beginning. Then Mr. Carter connected the flash drive to a small television mounted on the conference room wall. My face appeared on the screen, seated in the old study where so many quiet decisions had been made. I looked older than I remembered, but I also looked peaceful. I smiled gently before speaking. "If you are watching this, it means you finally noticed that I am gone. I want you to know that I did not leave because I hated you. I left because I refused to spend whatever years I have left waiting to become important to people who had already built full lives without me. For 10 years, I convinced myself that you were simply busy. I defended every missed holiday, every forgotten birthday, every empty chair at the dinner table. I told myself that love was still there even when time was not. Maybe I was right. Maybe I was wrong. But eventually I realized something that changed everything. Love that is never expressed becomes impossible to recognize." I paused for a moment before continuing. "This is not a punishment. If I wanted revenge, I could have chosen a very different path. Instead, I chose peace. I have given part of what I built to people who still have dreams waiting for an opportunity. Scholarships, community programs, and libraries will help strangers I will probably never meet. That thought brings me more comfort than holding on to resentment ever could. As for the rest, it will allow me to live whatever time remains with independence and dignity. That is not something anyone should have to apologize for." I smiled once more, softer this time. "Michael, you were once a little boy who reached for my hand every time we crossed the street. I have never stopped loving you. Laura, I truly hope your family continues to laugh around the dinner table for many years. Ethan and Sophie, if you ever remember your grandfather, remember that he loved you even when life carried us in different directions. Do not spend your own lives assuming there will always be another holiday, another birthday, another visit. Time is generous until suddenly it is not." The screen faded to black, leaving only silence inside the room. Hundreds of miles away, I was sitting on a weathered bench overlooking the Atlantic Ocean as fishing boats drifted slowly toward the harbor beneath the warm afternoon sun. Children laughed along the boardwalk. A young couple walked past holding hands. Somewhere nearby, church bells echoed across the water. I took a slow breath of the salty air and realized there was nothing left to carry except gratitude. I had not disappeared from my own life. I had finally stepped back into it. The greatest tragedy is not growing old. The greatest tragedy is believing your worth depends on whether someone remembers to call. The moment I stopped waiting to be remembered was the moment I finally became free.